Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to show you the easiest way to paint watercolor trees, winter edition. We'll talk about this specific technique, the right colors to use, and how to get that wintry, icy feel. For this technique, it doesn't matter what watercolors you use. I am using my limited palette, and I'm only going to be using indigo, cerulean, and a little bit of magenta from my palette. You can use any watercolor paper. I'm using Arches, and I'm using a size 10 round brush and a size 4 long round brush, both from Princeton. If you've been a subscriber of mine, you might know that I have another video that's very similar to this, talking about the easiest way to paint trees, but I got a comment on that video asking, how do I take this technique and make wintry trees that feel icy? So the technique's a little bit different, some similarities, and I want to walk through that process with you for this video. First, you need to start with very clean water and kind of make some dabbing strokes on your paper. We just want to get the paper a little bit wet, make some blobs of water. Then we're going to tap in some cerulean and indigo into those blobs of water that we've already created. I really want this to be very watery. That's going to be the key to keeping this very light and very icy feeling instead of having too much color and looking like we've just painted blue trees versus having that icy cold feeling that we're trying to achieve. And because we're trying to paint icy feeling trees and not blue trees, we are keeping a lot of the main part of the tree clear. We're not painting it. So we're just doing a tiny bit of watercolor, especially around the edges and in places where there might be some shadow, but we're letting a lot of that water that we painted initially stay clean with a very slight and natural bleed. Now this top blob is the top of our trees, so we've got a very distinctly fluffy tree shape going on. Now we need the shape of the ground. So it's a little bit more ground shaped, but still really fluffy, and I'm doing the same technique of clean water, a little bit of color, but letting everything bleed naturally so we still have that icy feel of maybe snow on the ground below the trees. One thing that is very important about this technique is we need to move very quickly so that the top of our trees and the ground are still very wet so we can do this next technique, which is what makes these trees the easiest watercolor trees to paint. I am using the long round size 4, and I am just swiping between the top blob and the bottom blob, making the tree trunks. So I'm using the colors that are in the top and in the bottom as the tree trunks, just swiping up and down very quick to make lots of different tree trunks. The lightest pressure that you can use and the quickest you can flick your brush around, the more organic the trunks and the tree branches will look. So you can also do the little tree branches coming to the side, but also keep in mind that it's going to be very light because we're using very watery washes of color. So if you need a little bit more color to improve how the tree trunks look, you can always dab some of that color into the top blob or the bottom blob, move that color around, and then use it to swipe up and create a maybe more bold tree trunk in different areas. I also really wanted to kind of ground the painting with some dark indigo on the bottom, so I did that and made it touch into that blob so that it gives a nice gradual blend. And then I thought, okay, in those darker areas, why don't I add some salt and see what it does? In one of my more recent videos, we did a salt experiment, and the more watery it is and the more pigmented it is, it will take up that salt and leave these really pretty blooms. So I focused the salt on the more pigmented areas because I knew it wasn't going to be as contrasted in these lighter areas, but I sprinkled it kind of everywhere. And I just really love this overall look, the way that the top blends into the trunk and then down into the ground or the snow just really highlights the beauty of watercolor and the way that it blends and looks very uniform. I also took a little bit of a darker color and added some scraggly tree branches and scrub just to give a little bit more texture, but I still wanted to do this part while it was still wet so that everything continues to blend and bleed together, kind of giving that continuous harmony feeling. And now I'm just dancing with my brush through the painting, adding little bits of branches here and there with the very tip of my brush, doing just very quick swipes. That's why I like using some kind of longer brush that has a very pointed tip. It's really easy to get those beautiful swipes that look very much like scraggly tree branches in the wintertime. And to keep these trees super easy and simple, we aren't going to add anything to them once they are dry. So now it's dry. The only thing we're going to do is I'm going to use a card to remove the salt. Please don't remove the salt until it is 100% completely dry so that the paint does not smear. And you can see the salt definitely shows up in the lower pigmented areas, but not really in the lighter areas. So just keep that in mind when you're adding it. Now, I think these trees turned out so beautifully. This is just a perfect light icy tree, and I could see it in a beautiful icy wintry landscape, maybe with a stag as the center focus. It would be just perfect. Now I wanted to show you two other ways that you can create the same icy look, but in different ways. So the first way, I wanted to see how I could maybe recreate this look just using one color. So using cerulean only and water. So the beautiful part about watercolor is you can water it down and get light versions of a color, and then you can use it more pigmented by picking up more paint or tapping the water off on your paper towel to get a darker, more concentrated color. So we can use one color in a painting and have a very wide range of values, and value is the lightness or darkness of a color. So it's a really great exercise to practice how dark can I add just this one color and how light can I get it as well. So for this one, I tried to change up the shape of the tree leaves, the icy tree leaves that are above in the top blob, because I wanted them to be a little bit more separated so I could see some of the tree branches between them. And then I wanted to do a very similar snowy landscape at the bottom, but again, still keeping it very light. Now you'll see the problem with keeping it too light was I didn't have enough pigment for the tree trunks. Because I'm swiping that color from the top tree to the bottom ground, if I don't have any pigment, I can't see a tree trunk. So I did add a little bit more cerulean here and there to help me kind of move that color around and use it for my tree trunks and my tree branches, just to have a little bit more than just complete water that I had before. Because remember too, watercolor dries a lot lighter than it paints, and so this is going to be even lighter than it appears now. I think what's really fun about this, though, is it looks like trees in the distance. The idea of the trees there that are really light and faded is just so cool to me that it looks like it took you a lot of work and a lot of time, and we're just swiping up and down between blobs and making these tree trunks, and it looks really impressive. We can add a little bit of color, especially while it's still wet, and again, we're just using cerulean. And then it looks like the trees that are darker might be a little bit closer, might be in shadow, but I just think this would be a great technique in a landscape that was snowy and icy, and maybe these are the trees far away in the background. I also added a little bit of salt, but spoiler alert, it does nothing. It does absolutely nothing to change the look of these trees, and it's really because there's not enough pigment to pull in to the salt to create those blooms. So I tried. I wanted to create some kind of icy feeling, but it's already pretty icy enough. So this next one is our last one, and I wanted to try a few different things, especially because I feel like I learned a lot on that top one on what I could do to help the flow between the top blob and the bottom blob. So for this one, I wanted to use all the colors: cerulean, indigo, some magenta for shadow I thought would be really nice, but I really just wanted to try using more pigment because I wanted those tree trunks to form a little bit easier than they did on the top one. So I do the top blob, the tree leaves, pretty much like I did the other two, but then this bottom one, I went pretty hard and heavy with the magenta and the indigo, giving it a lot of color so that I can very easily use that color to create the tree trunks. So you can see I'm having a much easier time than I did above, creating tree trunks that are actually visible and beautiful. And I thought it worked really well to have a lot of that color on the ground, on the snow, so that it looks like there's maybe a shadow down in the snow, but the leaves and the top of the trees are still really light and icy. I also really liked that with this one, there was a lot of layering and texture within the ground blob. So it didn't look like all of the trees were on the same plane, and it had a little bit more interest, and I could make some look farther away and keep them really light, and then I could darken some tree branches and tree trunks that were maybe felt closer to make them appear closer. And I will say this whole process of creating these very easy watercolor trees is a lot easier when you're using typical colors. It's a little bit more of a challenge to make them look icy and light and snowy in these lighter blue colors, but also leaving a lot of water because you want it to look like there's snow and ice and coldness there. But it was a really, really fun challenge. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something new and saw the difference in the process between, the typical trees that we formed in my other video and these trees as well. I always make sure to hit my salt with a final warm touch of hot air from a blow dryer or a heat tool before I remove it so that there is no smearing. That is just the worst feeling when you smear paint trying to remove salt at the end of a painting. But again, it didn't do a whole lot to each of these paintings, but it gave a little bit of texture to the more pigmented tree line on the bottom. And that is it. If you wanted to go back in, you could darken up some of the tree trunks to make some of them look even closer, but I really love the very light and airy and icy feeling of these trees. It would be perfect for background trees in a winter painting because they would look far away and kind of snow covered. I hope you all love this painting, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.